It started the day I moved into my new property, a quiet ranch outside of town, surrounded by oak trees and the kind of peaceful silence you can't buy in the city. I'd been dreaming of this place for years. After 2 decades of high-pressure legal work, I wanted nothing more than to be left alone, to build a quiet life with a garden, a few chickens, and maybe a dog. But peace, I soon discovered, is a commodity heavily taxed by those who believe they are in charge. The first letter arrived 2 days after I moved in. It was from the Sunset Hills Homeowners Association. It welcomed me to the neighborhood and then listed 6 violations I had allegedly committed. My fence was the wrong color, my grass was too tall, and I had not submitted an architectural review for my tool shed. The letter concluded with a fine and a threat of legal action if I didn't comply. I was confused. My ranch was not part of any HOA. I had checked before purchasing. The nearest HOA-governed homes were nearly a mile away. Still, I chalked it up to a clerical error and sent a polite email to the address listed. I explained that my property fell outside the Sunset Hills boundaries and requested they update their records. A week later, I received another letter. This one accused me of ignoring official correspondence and escalated the fines. It was signed by Karen Mitchell, president of the Sunset Hills HOA. There was a phone number. I called it. Sunset Hills HOA, this is Karen, Inc. My name is Marcus Williams. I think there's been some kind of mix-up. I got your letter, but my property isn't part of Sunset Hills. A pause. You sure? What's your address? I gave it. Whatever. Pause. Well, it may not be technically included, but the HOA feels it's important that all neighboring properties maintain the same standards. It affects our home values. So, ... We're enforcing rules on a property that isn't under your jurisdiction. I prefer to think of it as proactive community management. I ended the call before I said something unprofessional. The next day, I dropped off a packet at the HOA office complete with my deed, parcel map, and a letter from the county stating unequivocally that my property was not, and had never been, under the authority of Sunset Hills. I thought that would be the end of it. But I underestimated Karen. 2 weeks later, a city code inspector showed up, told me he was responding to an anonymous complaint about unpermitted structures and land misuse. He left with nothing to cite but mentioned that the HOA had been unusually aggressive about calling in reports. That's when I decided to install security cameras. The footage didn't surprise Mikarin herself, snapping photos from across the fence line, sometimes stepping onto my land when she thought no one was watching. I sent her a cease and desist letter. She responded by doubling down, sending more violation notices, and even attempting to have my mailbox removed for being non-compliant. Then came the trespass warning. Karen placed a laminated sign just outside my driveway that read, "This property is in violation of community standards. Entry not advised." It was absurd and more. Importantly, illegal. I took photos, logged everything, and filed a police report. But they told me it was a civil matter. So I went back to what I do best: research. I began pulling records, checking incorporation documents, and digging into Sunset Hills HOA status. What I found was shocking. The HOA was technically defunct. Its corporate registration had lapsed 2 years prior. No dues had been filed with the state, and their legal authority had expired. Karen had been running the HOA as a private citizen with no legal standing. I compiled everything and scheduled a meeting with the city attorney, who confirmed what I suspected: Karen was operating under color of authority without any lawful backing. He agreed to send her a formal warning. But Karen was not one to back down. She escalated. Overnight, my fence was spray-painted with the word violation in red. My mailbox was smashed. Someone dumped a pile of grass clippings and trash at the end of my driveway. My cameras caught nothing. Whoever did it wore a mask and struck in the dead of night. But I had a suspicion. That's when I decided to fight fire with fire. I began documenting every interaction, every letter, every threat, every fake citation. I compiled it into a massive binder, complete with timestamps, photos, and legal annotations. I sent a copy to the county, one to the state HOA regulatory board. and one to the local news station under an anonymous tip. The first break came when a journalist called me for comment. I gave them everything off the record. They ran a story titled, "Local HOA President Accused of Targeting Non-Member Resident." The fallout was immediate. Several neighbors came forward. Karen had been bullying them too, especially newer residents, who didn't know their rights. She had issued fines, enforced made-up rules, and even threatened to tow cars parked in private driveways. I hosted a community meeting on my ranch. Dozens of neighbors showed up. I laid out the evidence and explained the limits of HOA authority. People were furious. That night, Karen showed up uninvited. She demanded I cease my smear campaign or face legal consequences. I stood up calmly and handed her a copy of the binder. "Karen, I am a lawyer, specializing in property law. What you've been doing isn't just unethical as criminal, and unless you want to see your name in a lawsuit, I suggest you walk away." She sputtered, threatened to call the police. "Please do," I said. "I'd love to explain this to them." She left. 2 days later, she called the cops, told them I was trespassing on her land, claimed I had built structures without permits, was housing illegal animals, and violating noise ordinances. When the officers arrived, I greeted them politely. They asked if I had any documentation proving ownership. I handed them a folder with everything. Deed, plat map, correspondence with the county, even the letter from the city attorney. They left without incident, but it was clear Karen wasn't done, and neither was I. I didn't expect that Sunday morning wake-up call to end with police officers standing on my porch. The officer introduced himself as Officer Thompson, polite but clearly uncomfortable. "We received a complaint about threatening behavior," he said before I could even process the accusation. Karen came running out of nowhere, her bathrobe flapping and clipboard in hand like it was her sword. "Thank goodness you're here," she cried. "This man is making me feel unsafe. He's trespassing on our land, and I believe he's not even the legal owner." I blinked. Did I hear that right?
No.
She looked at the officer with wild eyes. "I'm Karen Mitchell, president of the Sunset Hills HOA. This man is illegally occupying land that doesn't belong to him." The way she said it, you'd think I was squatting in a condemned building and cooking meth in the kitchen. Raised an eyebrow. "Ma'am, are you saying Mr. Williams is trespassing on property that isn't his?" Karen nodded so hard I thought she might strain her neck. "Exactly. I believe his paperwork is fraudulent. This land should belong to the community." I took a breath, trying to remain calm. "I have all the legal documentation. Would you like to see the deed, the property tax statements, the plat map?" Before the officer could respond, Karen screamed, "Don't let him go inside. He could be destroying evidence." I watched the sergeant's expression change from polite patience to subtle disbelief. That was the moment I realized I had to end this circus. I reached into my wallet and pulled out my business card, handing it to him. "Marcus Williams," I said. "Property attorney for the last 12 years. I specialize in ownership disputes." Sergeant read the card and his eyes narrowed in recognition. "You're a lawyer?" Karen's smug face crumpled instantly. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. "That's not possible," she whispered. "Oh, it's possible," I said quietly. The air shifted. The sergeant turned. "To her, ma'am? Did you know Mr. Williams was an attorney when you filed this complaint?" "He never told me," Karen protested. He was pretending to be some normal person. Officer Thompson exchanged a look with his partner. "Specialize in property disputes?" I nodded. "That's correct. I'm happy to show you every legal document confirming ownership. But what concerns me is that Ms. Mitchell has just accused me of criminal fraud, based on zero evidence." Karen's voice got shrill. "But he's still violating HOA rules. His fence is the wrong color, and there are chickens, and ma'am." The sergeant interrupted. "This property appears to fall outside your neighborhood's legal jurisdiction." I added, "In fact, according to the county records, the Sunset Hills HOA isn't even a registered legal entity. There is no president. There are no binding rules, and she has no legal power over my land." The silence that followed was deafening. Karen's face went pale. I'm the president of what?" I asked gently. A fantasy club? The sergeant finally closed his notebook. Ma'am, filing false police reports is a criminal offense. Making accusations about land ownership without evidence, especially against a property attorney, is unwise. Karen's shoulders collapsed. I was just trying to protect our neighborhood, she mumbled. The officers prepared to leave, but before they did, I said one final thing. We need to talk, Karen. You've been harassing me for weeks. And now you filed a false police report. I suggest we have a serious conversation before this becomes something much worse. She didn't say anything, just nodded, lips pressed together. After the police left, I invited Karen into my kitchen. She followed, not like the clipboard queen she'd been for weeks, but like someone walking into a courtroom to hear their sentence. I made us both coffee and gestured toward the table. Sit, I said, politely but firmly. She sat. Her hands shook. Sugar? I asked. She shook her head. Karen, I began. When you asked me earlier if I was a lawyer or something, you were closer than you realized. I've practiced property law for over a decade. I've been called ruthless by my peers. I don't lose cases. Karen's cup rattled on its saucer. I leaned in. What I want to understand is why. Why harass me? Why file fake complaints? Why lie to law enforcement? Her voice came out in a whisper. Because your property lowers our home values, I was scared. I let her words hang in the air. So because you didn't like the color of my fence, you filed complaints with animal control, building inspections, and even the police.
Ow.
Because you were scared? Karen nodded miserably. You hired someone to investigate me? You stalked my property line? You accused me of trespassing on my own land? Do you know how serious this is? Tears welled in her eyes. Karen, I could sue you. Harassment, false reports, emotional distress, defamation. You'd be drowning in legal fees for years. Are you going to? She asked, her voice breaking. I paused, then said, that depends on what happens next. She looked at me, terrified. You're going to write apology letters to every department you lied to. You're going to stop calling yourself HOA president. You're going to leave me alone. And you're going to get help. Karen clutched her coffee mug like it was a lifeline. I do all that? Will you promise not to sue me? I promise nothing. But I believe in second chances. If you cross the line again, I will unleash every legal tool I have. Karen broke down, not in the fake tears way she'd used with the police, but real, uncontrollable sobbing. I lost everything in my divorce, she cried. This house is all I have left. I just wanted to protect it. For the first time, I felt something that resembled sympathy. Not forgiveness, not yet, but understanding. I get it, I said. But you picked the wrong way to fight, and you picked the wrong man to mess with. She nodded through tears. You got lucky, Karen. I didn't destroy you. Someone else might have. That night, I received a handwritten letter under my front door, 3 pages long. It was an apology. She admitted everything, the lies, the false complaints, the fake HOA presidency, the stalking, the accusations. Didn't try to excuse herself, didn't shift the blame. And that was a start. A few days later, she brought a homemade pie to my porch. I don't expect forgiveness, she said, but thank you for not ruining my life. I took the pie. I didn't do it for you, I replied. I did it because I wanted peace. Karen nodded. I'm seeing a therapist now. I'm working on myself. And to my surprise, she meant it. In the weeks that followed, I saw the transformation. The fake complaints stopped. Her attitude changed. She even began volunteering at the local animal shelter. The Karen who once tried to run me off my land was now walking rescue dogs and handing out flyers for spay-neuter. Clinics, it wasn't what I expected. It was better. And that, more than any legal win, felt like true resolution. Thank you for coming so quickly, Karen called out, rushing toward the officers with obvious excitement. I'm Karen Mitchell, president of the Sunset Hills HOA. This man is illegally occupying land that doesn't belong to him. The way she said it made it sound like I was some kind of squatter who had been living in abandoned buildings. Officers. I have reason to believe this man cannot prove legal ownership of this property, she said, practically bouncing with anticipation like she was about to witness the greatest triumph of her life. The sergeant looked from Karen to me, clearly trying to assess what kind of situation he was dealing with. Ma'am, you're saying Mr. Williams is trespassing on property? That isn't his, he asked, seeking clarification. Karen nodded enthusiastically, pulling out yet another folder full of her handwritten notes and documentation. Exactly. He claims to own this land, but I believe his paperwork is fraudulent. This property should belong to the community, she declared. Though her hesitation suggested she hadn't fully thought through the legal implications of her accusation, sir. Do you have documentation proving ownership of this property? The sergeant asked me. I nodded calmly, despite the absurdity of having to prove I owned my own home to police officers. Of course I do, and get the deed and title paperwork right now if you need to see them. As I turned toward my house, Karen practically shouted, "Don't let him go inside. He could be destroying evidence." The sergeant gave her a look that suggested his patience with her dramatics was wearing thin. That's when I realized this situation had gone far enough. Karen's behavior had escalated to the point where she was wasting police resources and making false accusations that could have serious consequences. I turned back to the officers and said, "Before I get the property documents, there's something you should know about who you're dealing with." I reached into my wallet and pulled out my business card, handing it to the sergeant. "I'm Marcus Williams. I specialize in handling exactly these kinds of property disputes." The sergeant read the card and looked up at me with surprise. His face shifted from stern authority to genuine interest as he processed this new information. He glanced over at Karen, who had gone completely pale, and I knew that moment would change everything about this confrontation. "You're a lawyer?" he asked, and I could see the gears turning in his head as he began to understand the implications. Of Karen's accusation? Yes, and property law is my specialty. "I think you'll find my ownership documents are perfectly legitimate." Karen's face went completely white as she processed what she'd just heard. "No, that's not possible," she whispered, staring at me like I just revealed I was an alien from another planet. Her entire confident demeanor crumbled in real time as she realized she had just accused a property attorney of illegally occupying property. "Ma'am, did you know Mr. Williams was an attorney when you filed this complaint?" The sergeant asked Karen, whose confidence was dissolving before our eyes. "Sir, he never told me," she stammered, looking desperately between the officers as if they could somehow make this new information disappear. He was pretending to be just a regular person. The sergeant's expression suggested he was beginning to understand exactly what kind of complaint he was dealing with. "Sir, you specialize in property disputes?" another officer asked, his voice tinged with professional curiosity. "That's correct."
Ow.
"It's been my primary area of practice for over a decade," I replied. Letting that information sink in for a moment, Karen was now in full panic mode. Realizing that her elaborate scheme to prove I was some kind of property criminal had backfired spectacularly. But he still has to prove he owns the land," she insisted, though her voice lacked any of its previous confidence. "And he's still violating HOA regulations." The sergeant looked at her with barely concealed exasperation. "Mr. Williams is a property attorney. I'm fairly confident he understands property ownership laws. Furthermore," I added, "Mitchell's HOA has no legal authority over my property. I'm located outside their development boundaries. And from what I've learned through my own research, the Sunset Hills HOA she claims to represent isn't actually a registered legal entity." Karen looked like she was about to collapse as her entire power structure crumbled around her. "That's not I am the president," she insisted weakly. But everyone could see that her authority was completely imaginary. The sergeant closed his notepad and looked directly at Karen. "Ma'am, filing false police reports is a serious offense. Making accusations about property ownership without any evidence is particularly problematic when you're dealing with someone who specializes in property law." Karen's eyes filled with tears as she realized the full extent of her mistake. "Didn't know? I was just trying to protect our neighborhood," she said. But her words sounded hollow even to herself as the officers prepared to leave. I looked directly at Karen and said, We need to have a serious conversation about everything that's happened over the past few weeks. As someone who's called ruthless by colleagues in the legal profession, I think you should understand the position you've put yourself in." Karen stared at me with a mixture of fear and confusion, finally beginning to comprehend that she had picked a fight with someone who was uniquely qualified to make her life very difficult indeed. After the police left, I invited Karen into my house for what I knew would be our final confrontation. She followed me inside like someone walking to their own execution. Her previous confidence completely evaporated. I poured 2 cups of coffee and gestured for her to sit at my kitchen table, noting how her hands shook as she accepted the cup. "Sugar?" I asked, maintaining the same calm demeanor I'd perfected during 12 years of high-stakes legal negotiations. Karen shook her head, unable to meet my eyes as the full weight of her situation began to sink in. "Let me explain something to you." "Karen," I began, settling into the chair across from her. "When you asked me earlier if I thought I was some kind of expert, if I was a lawyer or something, you were closer to the truth than you realized." I paused to let that sink in. Before continuing, my colleagues in the legal profession call me Ruthless Marcus because in 12 years of practicing property law, never lost a single case. Not one. Karen's cup rattled against the saucer as her hands continued to shake. "What? I want to understand," I continued, "is what drove you to harass someone you knew nothing about? What made you think you had the authority to dictate how I use my own property?" Karen's voice was barely above a whisper when she finally spoke. I just wanted the neighborhood to look nice. Your ranch makes our property values go down." It was the first time she'd been completely honest about her motivations, and I could see the fear in her eyes as she realized how weak her justifications sounded. "So you filed false complaints with multiple city departments?" "Conducted unauthorized monitoring on my property, hired someone to investigate my background, and ultimately filed a false police report claiming I was trespassing on my own land." I summarized, my voice remaining calm and measured. "All because you didn't like the color of my fence." Karen nodded miserably, tears starting to form in her eyes. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," she said. "I just got so angry when you wouldn't listen to me." That's when I leaned forward and looked directly into her eyes. "Karen, do you understand what you've done? You've committed multiple acts of harassment against a property attorney who specializes in exactly these types of disputes. You filed false reports with government agencies, engaged in stalking behavior, and made false accusations to law enforcement." Let each point hang in the air before continuing. "I could take you to court for harassment, false reporting, and unauthorized monitoring. Any one of these actions could result in serious legal consequences for you. Are you going to take legal action against me?" Karen asked, her voice breaking as she finally grasped the reality of her situation. I considered the question carefully, knowing that my answer would determine how this entire situation concluded. "That depends entirely on what happens next." I said I could file charges for harassment, false reporting, stalking, and defamation. I could seek restraining orders and civil damages. I could make your life extremely complicated and expensive. Karen broke down completely at that point, sobbing as she realized how thoroughly she had destroyed her own position. "I'm sorry," she kept repeating between tears. "I didn't know who you were. I would never have if I had known." But I wasn't interested in her apologies based on my professional status. "Karen, the problem isn't that you didn't know I was a lawyer. The problem is that you thought you had the right to harass and intimidate someone regardless of who they were. I lost everything in my divorce," she said through her tears. "The house is all I have left, and I was so scared that your ranch would make it worthless. I know that doesn't excuse what I did, but I was desperate. For the first time since this whole ordeal began, I felt a flicker of sympathy for Karen. Her behavior had been inexcusable, but I could understand the fear and desperation that had driven her to such extreme measures. "Here's what's going to happen," I said, my tone softening slightly. "You're going to write letters of apology to every city department you filed false complaints with. You're going to stop claiming to be president of an HOA that doesn't exist. You're going to leave me alone to live peacefully on my own property, and you're going to get some help for whatever issues drove you to this behavior in the first place." Karen nodded eagerly, grabbing onto this lifeline I was offering her. If you do all of that, I continued, I won't pursue legal action against you. But Karen, you need to understand something very clearly. If you ever harass me or anyone else in this neighborhood again, I will use every tool at my disposal to ensure you face the full consequences of your actions. And when people call me ruthless, they're not talking about my negotiation style. They're talking about what happens to people who try to abuse the legal system. As Karen prepared to leave, she turned back to me one final time. When you asked if I thought you were some kind of expert, if you were a lawyer or something, I had no idea. I nodded, remembering that moment, one that now seemed like a lifetime ago. The answer to your question, Karen, is yes. I am exactly the kind of expert you should have been worried about. But more than that, I'm someone who believes in using the law to protect people from exactly the kind of behavior you've been engaging in. 1 week after our kitchen table confrontation, I found a handwritten letter slipped under my front door. Karen's apology was 3 pages long, filled with genuine remorse and a detailed acknowledgement of every wrong thing she'd done over the past 2 months. She admitted to filing false complaints, conducting unauthorized monitoring, and making up an HOA presidency that never existed. Most importantly, she took full responsibility for her actions without making excuses or trying to shift blame. It was the first time since this whole ordeal began that Karen had shown any real understanding of how her behavior had affected others. 2 days later, Karen appeared at my fence carrying a homemade apple pie and wearing the most humble expression I'd ever seen on her face. I know I don't deserve forgiveness, she said, but I wanted to thank you for not destroying my life when you easily could have. I accepted the pie and invited her to sit on my porch, curious to see if her apparent transformation was genuine or just another manipulation. You could have taken me to court, had me arrested, and ruined my reputation permanently, she continued. Instead, you chose a different path. Karen, I didn't do it for you, I said honestly. I did it because I believe in second chances, because I moved here to find peace, not to wage war with my neighbors. She nodded, understanding the distinction. I've been seeing a therapist, she said quietly. She's helping me understand why I felt the need to control everything around me after my divorce. I know that doesn't excuse what I did, but I'm working on becoming a better person. There was something different about her demeanor, a genuine humility that had replaced her previous arrogance and aggression. Over the following weeks, I watched Karen follow through on every commitment she'd made. She sent formal apologies to the city departments she'd harassed, and I received confirmation that all the false complaints had been withdrawn from my record. She stopped patrolling the neighborhood like some kind of self-appointed security guard, and the other residents began to visibly relax as her reign of terror came to an end. Most surprisingly, she started volunteering at the local animal shelter, perhaps finding a healthier outlet for her need to feel useful and important. 1 month after our confrontation, I was working in my garden when Karen approached my fence with a different kind of nervousness than I'd seen before. Marcus, I have something to tell you, she said. Some of the neighbors want to form an actual HOA with proper registration and everything. They asked if I wanted to be involved, and I told them. I thought they should ask you instead. I looked up from my tomatoes, surprised by this development. They want me to join an HOA? I asked. No, Karen replied. They want you to be their legal advisor. They figure having a property attorney in the neighborhood would be a good thing. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. Karen's elaborate campaign to drive me away had ultimately resulted in the community wanting to embrace me as a valuable resource. I told them you probably wouldn't be interested, she continued, but that they should ask anyway, since you're the expert on these things. I considered the offer for a moment before declining. I appreciate the thought, but I'm retired from that kind of work. However, I'd be happy to recommend some excellent attorneys who specialize in HOA formation and management. As autumn arrived, my ranch had become something of a neighborhood gathering place. Children would stop by to pet the chickens and learn about gardening, while their parents enjoyed the peaceful atmosphere I'd worked so hard to create. Karen had become a regular visitor, not as an adversary, but as someone who genuinely appreciated the tranquility of rural life. I understand now why you painted your fence green, she said, one evening as we watched the sunset. It matches the natural landscape perfectly. White would have looked terrible out here. The final chapter of our story came 6 months after Karen's first appearance at my fence. I was sitting on my porch when my phone rang, a call from a potential new client, Mr. Williams. "I have an HOA dispute I need help with," the caller said. "There's this neighbor who's been harassing me, filing false complaints, claiming authority she doesn't have. Someone told me you're the guy to call when you're dealing with a real nightmare neighbor." I smiled as I listened to the familiar tale of HOA abuse and property harassment. "I appreciate the referral," I said, "but I'm retired from active practice. However, I can recommend several excellent attorneys who handle exactly these types of cases." As I hung up the phone, Karen walked by on her evening stroll and waved. "Another HOA problem?" she asked, having overheard part of the conversation. "Unfortunately, yes," I replied. "It seems like there's always someone who thinks they can use fake authority to control their neighbors' lives." Karen shook her head sadly. "I can't believe I was that person. When I think about what I put you through, I'm amazed you didn't have me arrested on the spot." I looked at her thoughtfully before responding. "You know, Karen, when people call me ruthless, they think it means I'm cruel or vindictive. But that's not what it means at all. It means I'm relentless in pursuing justice and protecting people's rights. Sometimes that requires crushing someone in court, but sometimes it means showing mercy to someone who's lost their way." "What made you decide to show mercy to me?" she asked. I considered the question as I watched my chickens settling in for the night. "Because I realized you weren't evil. I was desperate and scared. Evil people don't change, but desperate people can learn and grow if you give them the chance." Karen nodded, understanding the distinction. "Thank you for seeing the difference," she said quietly. "And thank you for being the kind of person who believes in second chances." As I watched Karen continue her evening walk, I reflected on the strange journey that had brought us to this point. She had started as my antagonist, someone determined to make my life miserable through false authority and bureaucratic harassment, but she had ended up teaching me something important about the difference between punishment and justice, between being ruthless and being wise. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do to someone who's wronged you is show them a better way to live. It's a lesson I wish more people understood, that true strength isn't about crushing your enemies, but about turning them into allies.